Converted Man here. There are many videos out there that will do a deep dive into the history of Jesus versus a mythological Jesus, but this is not one of those videos. My research is non-existent and spotty at best, and I'm looking at Wikipedia. So yeah, this can be completely pointless perhaps, but I have some must-sees and some mutterings to offer on this subject because I had somebody come in chat and be like, oh, Jesus is historical. Jesus is historical. Of course he is. Of course he is. How dare you deny history? And I don't think that they know what they're arguing for. So I will attempt to eliminate the subject to some degree. A historical Jesus is talked about by a number of people who study ancient history, who study the texts of the Bible, that study this, that, and the other. They are looking at this character that appears in, well, 4 different writings and then is mentioned by a few people later on. All those writings are now in the Bible that talk about Jesus, including Paul, who is considered sort of separate than part of the Bible. Like Paul's letters to the churches, those are seen as separate references to Jesus. And then Paul, of course, is put into canon, so Paul will appear in the Bible. Although Paul never met Jesus, because Jesus was already gone by the time Paul did what he did and saw what he supposedly saw. He supposedly met one of Jesus's brothers, but I don't know why I should believe what Paul says, but that's where this comes from. So the 4 main gospels are basically where the information about Jesus appears. But a historical Jesus is separate from a mundane man, the historical Jesus is the mundane man. Sorry, let me clarify. The historical Jesus is the mundane man version. The non-magical, non-miraculous Jesus is the historical Jesus. Now, a few historians that happen to be Christian would say that, yeah, Jesus' miracles are also historical. They really happened for real. They're not allegory. They're not myth. They happen. But the skeptical inquiry into that, of course, would have to set aside miracles as even being possible. So the mentions of Jesus and the life and times of Jesus don't give you very much to work with, but they give you enough to extract a mundane man of Jesus. And several different quests for the historical Jesus have taken place to construct a mundane man out of the writings of Jesus. And I suspect that churches that, especially evangelistic churches, would reject these quests on principle that they exclude the miracles. That Jesus would die and not come back in these compilings of the historical Jesus. The miracles that Jesus does would have to be absent from the mundane historical Jesus. It couldn't do miracles and be a historical figure. So the historical Jesus is a separate individual than the non-historical Jesus. The miracles of Jesus, the miraculous deeds attributed to Jesus by Christian and Islamic texts, faith healings, exorcisms, resurrections, control over nature, the least 7 miraculous signs, changing water to wine, raising Lazarus from the dead. And many people think that these are figurative stories. They're not literal. They didn't really happen. They're allegory. In other words, they're myth. They didn't happen. Jesus didn't actually turn water into wine. He didn't actually raise Lazarus from the dead. That when it says he did those things, it's actually meant to be taken as a story to tell you something about his ministry or something like that. It's myth, not fact. The miraculous Jesus is doubted by the skeptical historian. Wikipedia has it as highly skeptical approach. I don't know why it says highly. I just would say skeptical approach. But non-religious historians usually just avoid commenting on the veracity of the miracles. I'm not sure why. I don't know why they just don't say those didn't happen, but I guess they're trying to be generous. But some rule them out altogether, but some say, well, it's possible, and some are like, no, those definitely happen. So some of those could be possible, but maybe not as written. So healing people that were ill could have been that from the perspective of the viewers of Jesus, it appeared that he healed people that were ill, but the people that were ill recovered momentarily. So this would be kind of like a spiritual healer that's like, oh, stand up and walk, and the person that was in a wheelchair stands up and walks around for a bit. But what we don't know is that they're able to walk. It's just that they don't normally walk. But then they came in on a wheelchair. We're thinking, oh, they can't walk at all, and isn't it a miracle that now they can walk? So maybe Jesus's healings weren't as amazing as they come off as. And after all, these writings change over time, so whatever the original account was has been altered. But nonetheless, he could have done something that might have made it seem like he was healing people, and that it appears to be miraculous, but is quite mundane. Of course, healing blind people, that's a bit of a miracle, isn't it? So 2 unnamed blind men are there, and he heals them, different ones. Unnamed, and then, so there's a guy that's blind from birth that's healed, and he mixes dirt and mud and spit and places it on the man's eyes, and then the man washes his eyes, and when he does, then he's able to see. So is that just a metaphor? That is to say, it never really happened, or did it really happen? Well, the historian has to either say that miracles can really happen for real, or say, I doubt miracles because I'm a skeptic. Story, Jesus cures lepers, which would be quite a feat to do if he did it. Paralytics. Now, of course, curing of bleeding women, in other words, people having their periods. I don't know how that's a cure, but this again might be an exaggerated story, that the cure is that he's declaring that people on their periods aren't really sick. They aren't really tainted. And that just got exaggerated over time. And then there's other healings that are done. And then the exorcisms, of course, that could just be theater. He could just be like, hey, get out of there. And they're playing along with it because people play along with stuff, hypnotic suggestion thing. Of course, hypnotism is also just kind of a play art. So Jesus could be doing that, and that people think that the exorcism is real, rather than just performance art, is what's going on there. So we could include the exorcisms as being things that Jesus actually did and have that be part of a historical Jesus without having the exorcisms be real. Suffice it to say that the amount of things that, of course, resurrection of the dead, he raises daughter of Jairus from the dead, young man from dead, and of course Lazarus, the most famous one, brought back to life. So bringing people back to life, that's pretty significant. But it could be that these people weren't really dead. They just were declared dead, but there was a mistake made. It could be any number of things going on. It could be all symbolic. Who's to say? But the miracle Jesus is not the historical Jesus. The two are separate people. And you might want to argue, well, but the miracles were real. Okay, you can argue that, but then you're not talking about the historical Jesus anymore. So if you say, well, you're denying history because Jesus is a historical figure, I say you don't understand what the historians are doing here when they're referring to a historical Jesus. You have a non-magical Jesus talking to people, and this is a funny picture to me because these people in the background here, they can't hear what the hell he's saying. They're too far away, unless he's really, really booming his voice out. But this isn't built like an amphitheater, so I'm not really sure how well these people in the back could hear him. What did he say? I don't know. Something about have sex with your brother's wife? That sounds wrong. I don't know. I'm pretty sure he said to steal from somebody. No, he didn't say that. Quiet, I can't hear him. What was that back there? Shut up back there. Shut up. I can't see. Down in front. Oh, man, this guy, he's saying some major bullshit. You know, that guy in front, he can hear him. And this person back here, he's like, damn, man, Jesus just let out a big old fart. So he's really upset about that. But anyways, yeah, so the mundane teaching, somebody going around and getting enough people to listen to them, yeah, that could have happened, you know. But then we've got Jesus walking on water, and that can't happen. That's not possible. That's not a thing that happens. People don't walk on water. But if Jesus is miraculous, then Jesus can walk on water. But the walking on water Jesus isn't the historical Jesus, because the historical Jesus, the people that want Jesus to be historical have to take out the magical stuff that he does. But the typical theist Christian that doesn't know their own history because they don't know their own history has heard or read that Jesus is considered historical by historians, and that's enough for them. And they don't dive into deeper like I just did here, even though this isn't a very deep dive, because you could go even deeper with this and explore who the historians are. That would be nice to know. Who are they? What do they believe in? I don't know. You don't know. It just says historians. It just says scholars. Do they have credentials to be a historian? What makes somebody a scholar? Scholar is just kind of a label that we apply to people. It's not something that you really earn, per se. I'm a scholar. I've written a lot about one subject. That makes me a scholar. If I write about history, now I'm a historian. But I don't have any degrees in any of the things, you know, so those terms don't really necessarily mean anything unless they actually mean something. So you'd have to explore that. But you're not going to do that if you believe it's all true. Why would you? Well, you don't need to waste your time and energy to dive into the history. You just know that it's true, and that anybody that dares deny that it's history is just lying to themselves and coping and doesn't want to admit the reality that Jesus came back from the dead. No. Looking at it critically, the only mentions of Jesus coming back from the dead are the writings where the idea of Jesus comes from in the first place, and that's the only things that mention Jesus at all, except for later on you get a handful of people who mention people that believe in Jesus and don't necessarily reference Jesus as an actual person directly. It's hard to say that an actual Jesus actually was unless you subtract away the miracle stuff that he did. A coherent timeline of Jesus' life has never been constructed using the Bible and using history. Now, Pontius Pilate, who's a historical figure for real that we know existed, without a doubt, Pontius Pilate was a thing. In order for Jesus to get killed, sentenced to death by Pontius Pilate has to be in the area to do that. Now, we know Pontius Pilate wasn't in the area at certain times, so we could exclude when Pontius Pilate wasn't anywhere near Jesus. So then that narrows down the range of the end of Jesus' life. Once you figure out the end of Jesus' life, then you can go backwards from there and get the beginning of his life, because he's said to be about 33-ish, although that might be questionable too, but okay. Or maybe he's 30. Again, unclear. But assuming that the age is correct, you could go back, but then you can't, because when you do that and you try to align the Bible with what we know about where Pontius Pilate would have been when he needed to be there, nothing lines up. And the Bible, the accounts of Jesus doing things don't line up. You can't make a coherent timeline of Jesus. So that should lead into the skepticism towards that this person was a living, breathing person versus whatever living, breathing person might have existed is so buried under mythology and story that basically they're not even a person anymore. They used to be a normal guy, but then the legendary status just kept piling up and piling up. The stories were exaggerated. So the historical Jesus, if you want to argue, well, Jesus was a historical figure, you're not talking about the Jesus that performed miracles, which is the only important Jesus to talk about if you're a Christian, because that's the Jesus that matters. Jesus dying and coming back. The coming back part is the important part. The dying part, anybody can do that. The coming back part, that's really important for the Christians. In fact, it says, if that didn't happen, your faith is in vain. Well, Jesus didn't come back from the dead, so yes, your faith is in vain. But this is a really, really central tenet to Christianity, that Jesus rose from the dead. Reading through these Wikipedia articles, you'll find that the only thing that historians really agree on is that Jesus was baptized and executed. And that's it. He was baptized and crucified. That's the only things that they can actually agree on. So the rest of his life, they can't agree on that. Whoever they are. They, the anonymous they, this group of unknown historians that are out there. You don't know who they are. You don't know what they believe in. You're just told about them. How many are there? We don't, there's not like a grandmaster list. And so that's a problem if you are being even a little bit skeptically minded into wanting to research this matter further. I want to know what historians said what about Jesus. I want a metadata study. That's a huge undertaking because there's a lot of historians out there, a lot of people who've written a lot of books about Jesus. That's a lot of writing to wade through. But it would be just enough to know that they wrote something about Jesus, and well, then that makes them a scholar, I guess, or it might make them a historian, I guess, but we need some objective criteria to categorize people as historians or scholar, and if we're not doing that, then we're not being skeptical, so it gets worse and worse. So, there's about either, I think the number was, I want to say 37 off the top of my head. Let me see. Yeah, okay. So in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, there's about 37 miracles. Now, those are being, some of those are being counted more than once. So how many unique miracles did he do? And that number's lower. Some things say 40, some say, 7. It just depends what you consider to be a miracle. Now, are you counting the feeding of 5,000 people as one big miracle event, or are you counting that as each individual feeding a miracle? Then he's done 5,000 miracles in that case. So, it just depends. But if you subtract that number, because you're having to set aside the miraculous events, and I would also say, since Jesus doing things in order to fulfill prophecy, I see that as just narrative writing, that Jesus is said to do X, Y, and Z in order to fulfill prophecy. That's just them trying to make Jesus fulfill prophecy. So I'm automatically skeptical that happened. So that goes on the things that I have to subtract. The number of times that he escaped from authorities, like he just mysteriously escapes from authorities that are coming after him. Yeah, because they're really bad at capturing Jesus, I guess. And then they just give up, I guess, after he escapes. Like, they don't keep pursuing him. They don't they're not, like, actively looking for him. Yeah, sure, because that's, Rome was really bad about that sort of thing, keeping law and order, right? So those are miraculous or at least non-historical events in my view, so I put those to the side. After doing all that and doing some wonky math, I cut down the number of miracles from 37 to 7 unique miracles. Now, there's actually, I'm giving more room for leeway by doing that. Cutting down on that and subtracting all those events that I mentioned gives you, at the end of doing that, about a 40-ish% mundane Jesus, give or take, depending on how you do the math and all that. So it would actually be less if you have more miracles. So the more miracles you have, the less of a mundane Jesus you have. The less miracles, the more mundane. So the historical Jesus is, at best, I guess you could raise it, let's say 50%. You got a 50-50 split, at best. So that means 50% of Jesus' life is not historical, at best. Again, depending on how you do the math and what you count as a miracle, maybe you don't want to exclude him fulfilling prophecies or whatever. But the point is, if you do these things, you get a very low number of him doing just normal stuff. Talking to people, showing, just delivering messages, pretending to heal people, pretending to do exorcisms, so the number might go a little bit higher, for the mundane version of Jesus, but then it's not Christianity anymore. It's only Christianity if he does at least one miracle, the only important miracle, which is him coming back from the dead. That's really the only important miracle from the Christian perspective. But I don't know that any Christian would be willing to forego all the other miracles in order to keep that one. Like I say, look, sure, I'll accept Jesus as a historical figure if you allow for every miracle for except for the one that you need to go away. Would they really accept that terms? I don't think so. Maybe they would. But then you have like what? Maybe a 99% mythological or 99% mundane man with 1% being mythological. And why is it myth? Well, the thing is with myth is anytime anybody does something supernatural, magical, mystical, whatever you want to call it, that's myth. That's what its category is. And the reason is because we don't have an example of those things really happening. And the examples that we do have of so-called miracles are very, very questionable. There's books written on miracle events, miracle healings, and such that are not very well documented. This one person wrote how they saw a person regrow their limbs. But there's absolutely no medical records of that ever happening. And they don't list the dates or time or location, or they say it's extraordinarily, and nobody except for them saw it, so it's like, okay, yeah, no, that didn't happen. There's weird events that a lot of people have attested to. Like there was some, there's been more than one phenomenon in the sky that a bunch of people saw and seemed to be miraculous, but only because, well, it's something weird. What was it? Might have been a natural phenomenon that we just don't understand. And because the nature of miracles makes them untestable to some degree or completely. Oh wow, nerdy. That's terrible. I'm gonna put that up because that's great. Jesus had fed the 5,000, but Stalin made millions toast. That's bad. All right. The point is, a historical Jesus is extraordinarily different than a mythological Jesus. And whether you like the terminology mythology or not doesn't matter. Now, did Jesus really do the magic? That's the thing. The thing with that is, since we have no examples that miracles happen today, that all the examples that we could point to are questionable in nature, we have no concrete example of any miraculous anything that I can find or have ever seen anything that's well documented. And I mean well documented. I don't mean just like, well, the person died. No, because there's been lots of metadata studies done on NDEs, and not a single one of them has been shown to be objectively a thing. They've tried to do it, and it's failed every time. So, remote viewing has been tested. Astral projection has been tested. Every time you test these things, they vanish into the ether. So far, none of the so-called miracle stuff has ever actually been tested. You can't summon it on demand to test it. So I don't believe that miracles are even a thing. And I would need you to show me one for me to know that they are possible. Then and only then could I grant that maybe they could have happened in the past. Because the criteria of a skeptic is to not believe that something is unless we have empirical evidence, a repeatable test, or valid and sound argument for it. And we just don't have that for miracles. So that makes them myth. All the miracle claims of every religion that's out there are mythology. So, yeah, there is this historical Jesus, but that Jesus can't save your soul. Until next time, be skeptical, and after that, stay skeptical.